Shalom, shalom. Giving honor and praise to the Creator and the Maker of heaven and earth. This particular subject right here is concerning a meme. One of those things that people have that have a picture perhaps on it with some words and on it, and they're trying to convey a thought by that. This particular meme that I'm speaking of is the one that speaks of Anthony Johnson, who, according to that meme, in the mid 17th century, 1654, 1655, was the pioneer of American slavery. Now, let's look up the definition of the word pioneer to gain an understanding. Now, the first reference that I'm going to use concerning this comes from this right here, and that is the American Heritage College Dictionary, 4th edition. Okay? And the definition of pioneer is as follows: one who goes into unknown or unclaimed territory to settle. Definition number 2: one who opens up new areas of thought, research, or development. Now let's maintain that understanding that a pioneer is one who opens up new areas of thought, research, or development. Now, in order to sit there and explain that Anthony Johnson is not the pioneer of American slavery, we're going to have to sit there and let it be noted, when did American slavery start? So, I'm going to use as a second reference to support my claim that Anthony Johnson was not the pioneer of American slavery by reading this book here, part of it, by Paul Johnson, entitled A History of the American People. Now, in part of this book, on page 4, here is what we read. It says, in the 1440s, exploring the African coast from their newly acquired islands, the Portuguese rediscovered slavery as a working commercial institution. And on page 5, the author says the following: the Portuguese entered the slave trade in the mid 15th century, took it over, and in the process transformed it into something more impersonal and horrible than it had been either in antiquity or medieval Africa. Now, wanted to sit there and mention that because this author right here speaks about how the Portuguese were the people who were of the European people, that is, that really went off and set off the slave trade within what you call Africa. Okay? Bringing slaves out of Africa, or bringing captives out of Africa, that is to say, and that were unfortunately later made into slaves. Okay, now, that's very, very important to let that be noted and understood. The next source I'm going to use comes from this book here entitled A History of the Atlantic Slave Trade, Black Cargoes, Daniel Mannix, in collaboration with Malcolm Cowley. And on page 54 of this book, I want to read part of it. Matter of fact, let's go to page 17 and see what it says. It says, there were no slave harbors in the Gold Coast, but there were dozens of European forts and factories, depots for goods and slaves, often in sight of each other. Some of the famous forts were Axum by the Dutch, Elmina by the Dutch, Cape Coast Castle, Amanabo by the English, Coromantine, the first English fort built in 1631, but captured and held by the Dutch in 1665, and Accra, where Dutch, English, and Danish forts stood within gunshot range. So I just wanted to sit there and have that part read, just to let it be noted that you had the English, that is the British, that is, you had the Dutch, and then you had these particular nations along with them with the Danish, because the Danish people had black people as slaves in what you call certain South American countries and how they competed with each other concerning the slave trade. Now, in the same book here, on page 54, here's what we read. The importance in reading that is because that right there dated until 1631. But this Anthony Johnson, who they say is the pioneer of American slavery, was supposed to have been in the 1650s. But let's see what history itself says. Balboa had 30 Negroes when he had discovered the Pacific. Now that being in the era between 1513 and 1519. Cortez brought 300 slaves to the conquest of Mexico. By 1530, there were so many Negro slaves in Mexico that they plotted a rebellion. The first Negro slaves were brought to Brazil in 1538. Probably the first Negro slaves to arrive on the United States mainland were imported by Lucas Vasquez de Leon in 1526. There were Negro slaves in other North American Spanish settlements from its founding in 1565 to the end of the Civil War in 1865, a period of exactly 3 centuries. There were slaves in St. Augustine, Florida. But as far as the English colonies to the north were concerned, the slave trade began in 1619 when a Dutch man of war, probably a privateer sailing under the letters of marque from the Prince of Orange, put into the newly established colony of Jamestown, Virginia, 20 Negroes. So one of the things to sit there and let it be noted is that when you study about those 20 people that were black people that were brought to Virginia in 1619 as slaves, they were already being enslaved by the Spanish. And the Dutch captured the Spanish ship and then brought that group of people who were black, 20 people in number, over to what you call Jamestown, Virginia. So this right here in history has to be known and understood. So now the dates that we're speaking of so far have been 1538 and 1565. But they say that the pioneer of American slavery, brothers and sisters, was a black man named Anthony Johnson. Now, one of the first things to ask is, how does a black man become the pioneer of American slavery? That's one thing. Secondly, how does this man have the name Anthony Johnson? Somebody had to been his slave master beforehand for him to even acquire such a name. Because when we came into the slave ships, the canoes, we did not have names like Vernon and John and Anthony and Malcolm. These are names that we acquired by the Europeans. So let that be noted and understood. I have another book for reference material, and I like to show it. It is entitled The Slave Trade. The Story of the Atlantic Slave Trade. Note the date, 1440 to 1870, by Hugh Thomas. So now I want to read a part of this, brothers and sisters, on page 171. And here's what we read. It says, still, most slaves taken to New Holland, they averaged 1,500 a year by the late 1630s, continued to be captured at sea from Portuguese ships. Now, New Holland was in what you call, part of what you call the northern states of America. So let that be noted and understood. And this is the quote right here, right? Captured, continued to be captured at sea from Portuguese ships. It was the Dutch in this particular case that was doing that. And the date that it gives, brothers and sisters, is the 1630s. So therefore, there's no way in the world that New Holland, being in what you call the country that we now call the United States, is part of. That being the case, you can't say that a black man in the 1650s was the pioneer of American slavery. That right there, in definition-wise and his story, timeline is incorrect. Okay, so now, brothers and sisters, let's go in the same book right here and go into page 172. It says the Danes soon became keen to found an African company of their own, and in 1625 a Dutch merchant settled in Copenhagen. Johannes de Willem received a license to operate in the West Indies, Brazil, Virginia, and Guinea, a vast chain of territories which, however, in the 17th century seemed to be one. So I just want to sit there and let it be noted that the date that is given, this guy had a license given to him, was in the 1620s, right? And it says in the West Indies, Brazil, and Virginia. So that right there is very, very important to let that be noted in history. Let's go, if we will, into page 174 concerning this subject, and we're going to read part of it. It says, in 1619, John Wolfe, the Norfolk-born first recorder of Virginia, already a grower of tobacco, who had been recently left a widower by Princess Pocahontas, noted, about the last of August came a Dutch man of war that sold us 20 Negroes. This comment is usually held to be the first reference to the import of black slaves in what became the United States, though Pánfilo de Narváez, Méndez de Avilés, and Coronado had all taken slaves with them in their expeditions to the conquest of Florida and New Mexico the previous century, and it is unclear what transpired in 1619. So now, this right here gets into the history that you had people that were being brought into what you call now the part now called the United States, that were blacks as slaves prior to the era of 1619. But they try to sit there and pinpoint that 1619 date because most of the times they usually look at it from the era and the aspect of the situation with the British. But we have to remember that the Portuguese set off the slave trade. The Dutch, as we already noted, was taking over slave ships from the Portuguese. And as we already read in this other book here entitled Black Cargoes, as we see right here, we see that the Dutch and the English already was bartering within each other for slaves. So therefore, the Dutch was taken over in certain cases by the British. And the British set up what you call within the United States of today, American slavery. So it was not Anthony Johnson. He was not the pioneer of such. So let that be noted and understood. Now, brothers and sisters, I like to sit there and read, before we conclude, the definition of the word pioneer yet again. It says, one who goes into unknown or unclaimed territory to settle. Anthony Johnson didn't do that because where he was brought to was a place that was already claimed by people. One who opens up new areas of thought, research, or development. So even if you take the second definition, the slave trade occurred before his birth. So therefore, he could have not been the pioneer of American slavery. So let that be noted and understood. So that mean that's going around to many different people, brothers and sisters, is emphatically a straight lie. Okay, so I really want to sit there and drive that home. Now, going back into this book right here, entitled The Slave Trade by Hugh Thomas, I want to go to page 170 and read part of it and let it be noted what it says. The Dutch, by then, also had trading posts in North America. The first on Manhattan Island was set up in 1613. Settlements were also made in the Caribbean by the West India Company before 1630. So all of these different references, how are people going around trying to sit there and imply the idea that it was a black man that set up what you call American slavery as a pioneer and such? Such, brothers and sisters, is not the case. So that right there is something I really, really want to sit there and drive home. All right. Now, lastly, I have a book here entitled The Negro in the United States, page 28. In Maryland and Virginia, the two colonies in which the slave system first took root, the institution developed slowly in the 17th century. Previous to 1650, only small lots of Negroes, not exceeding 30, were imported from time to time into Virginia. So this is written by an author, and the name of the book is entitled The Negro in the United States. Okay, so let that be noted by Franklin Frazier. So get your history up. All right, peace.